Her goal is well-being for Santa Cruz residents in all its forms. Her method is to incorporate the aspect of health when developing public policy. We'll learn more about the Health in All Policies initiative and what it could mean from Santa Cruz from today's guest, Mayor Martine Watkins. Stay with us. Welcome back. Joining me now is Mayor Martine Watkins. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so excited to have you. I'm very interested, and I'm sure all our viewers are too, in learning about Health in All Policies. Can you give us a little background on it?
Sure. So Health in All Policies is really a public health approach to thinking about how government in all of its forms influences health and well-being. It's first adopted in the European nations and is sponsored by the World Health Organization. California actually has a initiative at the state level regarding health in all policies, but it's got different forms throughout our entire nation. And essentially it's a framework that is a public health framework used to look at how local government can incorporate health, incorporate equity and sustainability when considering all of the policy decisions that we make. I've found when describing what health in all policies is sometimes it's very large in terms of kind of what it can encompass. So for example, if we're thinking about a transportation type policy, how are we thinking about it in terms of the area in which we're going to prioritize our resources? And is it incorporating safe routes to school and canopies for trees? And so when we're really designing policy, how are we incorporating those three tenets into our decisions?
So when you're looking at these policies and you have those three pillars, equity, sustainability, and health, how do you judge a policy's equity?
Right. You know, I think one of the things that where we are today in Santa Cruz is really looking at what that means and defining that. And so the recent action that the council took was to really explore what does this policy framework look like in Santa Cruz? What would equity look like in terms of how we, in our local government, where we are today now, how are we going to use that lens? What about sustainability and thinking about climate change? And we have so many different we have a lot of different programs on the books already. So how are we building on that? So we're really in the process of inquiring into what does this framework mean for our local jurisdiction. And that's sort of the great part about what the Health in All Policies approach is that every jurisdiction can really take it and make it fit for their area and their community.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned climate change, and so that's one form of sustainability. Is sustainability covering anything else? Financial sustainability or neighborhood sustainability? What do you, when you say sustainability, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I think similar to kind of the equity approach is really looking at absolutely climate change, sustainability of a community. Financial sustainability, I feel, always has to play a role because essentially we have scarce resources. So how are we moving forward and applying those resources? But when we're thinking about sustainable communities and we're designing community for 30, 50 years with climate change, knowing we're experiencing it today, how are we taking that into consideration? What does that mean in terms of our community design? And we think about some of our recent actions at the council. We adopted a downtown amendment plan to our general plan. So thinking about access to transportation and public transportation, walkable community to get your food. And so when you start to think about sustainable community, that's that lens you're looking through. And it's sustainable in general, and then it's sustainable in terms of how are we thinking about for climate change and adapting that way, reducing carbon emissions and transportation. Yeah.
Do you have any great examples to point to? Are there any cities who are sort of a model for this?
There's actually a lot. You know, one of the things when sort of researching health in all policies you'll find is there's examples from in the state and outside the state. When researching recently, where kind of we're seeing success, the city of Chicago really came out as a real model in how they're incorporating health in all policies, whether it be them establishing sort of a universal pass to access libraries and parks and rec programs, how they're working on childhood obesity and access to healthy foods for families. They've had a really great approach to sort of institutionalizing what they want to have happen. And they're working with a lot of collaborative partners. One of the things about health in all policies is it's really saying, how can we as a local government take responsibility for health and then also work with our partners to expand their responsibility for health. So it's looking at intersectoral kind of work together to ensure that we can move in the same direction with the same sort of lens. The city of Richmond also has a health in all policies, San Francisco, Oakland, Monterey County, and they have various forms, health in all policies in the general plan or health in all policies when strategic planning. How are you incorporating it in your, often in your active transportation planning? So it takes on different forms depending on where the community is.
Mm-hmm. So, could you give a specific example of here was the issue and here was the policy and this is how we incorporated health?
So one of the things when I first started learning about what health in all policies was the city of Richmond's example. So I will draw on that in terms of my kind of understanding of it. And it's my interpretation, so I hope it may not be completely factually true. But when I remember reading about Richmond's example, they were seeing through epidemiology data, which is essentially health like lifespan outcomes, very extreme differences in terms of their residents. And so when incorporating and sort of looking at what are we doing at a local jurisdiction to change direction to support the health and well-being, they started to really adopt that approach. And they, when you look at what they're doing, they look at it through sort of a prism of how they're thinking about health equity. So does that mean when prioritizing projects, you're looking at the areas that might be less off than other areas in terms of raising the bar for equity for those folks? I believe they were working with Chevron, and there was a big oil refinery up in there in terms of the economic well-being. And so it really started to take off in terms of how they're moving it. There is often generally some sort of type, usually it has elements of community partners that make up a sort of a steering committee. So often that is an incorporation of it. But really having that leadership at that highest level, I believe really helps propel it to a different kind of trajectory. So I'm excited to be able to offer that lens in this position now.
Oh yeah. So why does this approach appeal to you so much? Who seems to really be behind it?
Yeah, when I first started thinking about running for city council, my brother, who works for the county of San Mateo, who also has a background in public health, he kind of exposed me to this concept, and it just really clicked for me. My background is in education professionally, but I have my master's degree in public policy. So when thinking about what do cities do, and how can we start to think about preventative policy, upstream sort of investment, also with dealing with the immediate, but thinking about the long term in terms of how are we systemically trying to move us in the right direction for well-being for all. He was really helpful in sharing this example and framework. And it turns out this is a really nationally, internationally recognized framework that's been working in different jurisdictions. Mm-hmm. So he's the one that kind of helped expose me to it. And then working now after having 2 years on the council, one of the things that I've found is there's so many things that we have in common in terms of our efforts. Like, for example, in education, we were talking about workforce housing and teacher retention, and we're thinking about affordable housing and transportation and access to good jobs and kind of more livable wages. It's all really interconnected. And that, when you put it all together, leads to well-being and the health and vitality of a community. I was recently talking to some students, and I started with the question of what if you were to visualize what the characteristics of a healthy community are, what would those be? And you're welcome to say a few. I want to put you on the spot, but they came up with good jobs and clean air and access to good food and opportunities to have recreational experiences and safe, no blight. I mean, those are the types of characteristics that you think of when you think of a healthy community. And then, of course, when you're thinking of a community that's not thriving, often it's the opposite, right? Broken up streets and unsafe air quality, often freeways, maybe density of alcohol outlets, more density of tobacco outlets, more density of convenience stores and not healthy food stores, lack of economic opportunity, lack of affordable housing and transportation options. So I think we know instinctually of the healthy communities that we want to live in. So what is our role as policymakers in designing our communities to be those healthy communities? But we can't do it alone. So how are we working with our partners to do that? And that's one of the great things about Santa Cruz. We're so connected in so many ways that partners are always usually willing to come to the table and start the conversation to work on these really important issues.
Who are the partners that you're looking at now?
You caught me at the very beginning. Maybe we can come back actually in a couple of months, because we set up actually a work plan for about 9 months to move forward in really exploring what are we doing in terms of our internal kind of reflection on health and all policies, but how are we working with our partners? We went through a list in terms of some of the different plans we have and existing partnerships, such as the County Partnership for CORE, which is our collective, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the O. It'll come to me. It's our community programming dollars that goes out to nonprofits and other community partners to support our residents. Climate adaptation planning, a number of different partnerships underway. So we really want to make sure that we're not creating more, and if we already have what is really kind of the recipe or the ingredients, if you will, for a good recipe for what health and all policies can be for Santa Cruz.
So Santa Cruz, a pretty progressive community, has kind of been taking these things into consideration over time. What sorts of things have you found that are already happening that kind of fold into this new lens?
So we have our climate adaptation plan, climate mitigation plan. We have our active transportation planning. We have our general plan. Many of our actual subsets of the general plan incorporate health and well-being. We have our partnership with the county for CORE and collective impact. We recently established a children's fund, which I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that. So really looking at some of these existing efforts, planning efforts and partnerships, and absolutely building on those.
So let's talk about the Children's Health Plan. How does that children's plan, what parts of that plan resonate with the health and all policies?
Well, if you think about really health and well-being and you're thinking about it from the future and you're investing for the future, that's the place to start. And it also is a real, from my background, it's a real priority for me. So the city of Santa Cruz actually established a children's fund that came about 1.5 years ago, maybe a little bit less than that. When cannabis became recreational and went online, we voted at the council level to set aside 1% of the revenue to go to early childhood education, prevention, and vulnerable youth populations. And that is now generating revenue, so there will be some processes around how to support in partnership with our city schools partners and education partners and other partners doing the work to support our city's residents that are our youngest residents struggling. And that could look like through scholarships and access to our recreation programs, supporting childcare for some of the families that are struggling to live here and struggle with the cost of good quality childcare, and other preventative type programming. And if you're thinking about designing the future, you want to have our next generation of Santa Cruzans prepared and supported and ready to go and to be able to live here. I mean, we also are seeing a demographic shift in terms of the residents that can stay here, and we're seeing a decrease in our families, or the age range in which you would assume families would be here, about the 25 to 55-year-old range. So how are we supporting families being able to raise their kids here? So, and that is essentially sustainability and equity, if we're thinking about it for everybody, and public health. And one of the things we also did recently to support our youth is we put a ban on flavored tobacco. And I'm not sure if folks are following that, but there's been a real concern and rise in the use of vaping and flavored tobacco, specifically around our younger children. This is nationally and statewide. So local communities can say, not here, we're going to prioritize our kids and put a ban recently on flavored tobacco. So those are the types of kind of policy lens approaches that really, fit within the public health framework of health in all policies.
No, you're at the beginning of this, so you probably haven't freaked out any targets yet. But if you personally were asked what area of well-being would you like to attack first, what would be your first policy?
Gosh, that's a tricky one. It's really hard. For me, I think ultimately one of the great ways that I feel really good about the direction we're going is I want this to be something we all share as a desire to be a part of. So for me, we electeds can come in, or mayors have their one-year term, and you have your issue or your initiative or what have you. For me, it's saying, how do we pause and reflect on our institution, and how do we collectively move forward in improving the health outcomes for folks? So I guess if anything from this initiative for me is that we start to do things differently, not necessarily doing more, but how do we as an institution start to shift in that regard? And we have sometimes an approach of policy where you're sort of siloed in your decision making. And how do we move outside of that? And when we're thinking about the broader vision of a healthy community for the future. And it's tricky sometimes, but often we need to be reminded of that this isn't just one decision about one anything. You could, you name it, one specific issue that's, in one area or one aspect of our jobs, but it's really about how does that fit collectively? And ultimately, for me, it would be how are we improving the health equity for all of our residents? How are we seeing folks do here? Are we seeing it for some and not others? Are we increasing access so that more folks can thrive in this community, get jobs, stay here, raise their kids, age here, play here? How are we doing in that regard? Part of it also requires that we stop and kind of take a baseline data kind of analysis of where we're at now, so that when we start to make interventions and changes, we're able to track our progress. And if we're not seeing where we want to go, then we have to have the courage to change direction. And sometimes that's hard,
Where do you want to go? What's the city's goal with this?
Yeah, for me, it would be to I think for me, ultimately to be well-being for the community for the next generation.
What's well-being? When you get there, what will you see?
I would see more families being able to stay here. I would see more affordable or cost, I guess it would be a cost of living imbalance sort of bridged. How do we get more affordable housing but also wages up so that people can actually thrive here? I'd see less folks having to move out of our community and commute from wherever that's more affordable for them, and seeing less congestion on the freeway. I'd see less youth engaging in at-risk behaviors, folks aging in their homes or having opportunities and housing choices. I'd see us adapting to climate change and being prepared for that. And if there is a situation that arises that we're not leaving any vulnerable populations out, maybe they're not for whatever reason. Generally, when thinking about climate change and adaptation, you can often see that if you don't speak the language and you're letting folks know that there's a situation in one language, how are you planning for that? It's sort of thinking it through that lens. And ultimately, I'd see how we're, as a collective government, saying we're going to move beyond our traditional lens of sort of siloed decision making to say we're going to think about this through a different lens. If this fits a criteria of public health and well-being, if this policy decision fits the criteria of sustainability, if we're thinking and factoring in equity, what does that lead to in terms of policy changes? And I think, what you'll find is often, hopefully, a thriving community that's doing well, that you'll see, maybe obesity rates go down, or you'll see folks that are aging are feeling connected to their community. You're having age-friendly communities. You're starting to look at things a little bit differently, sort of a different metric of how you're deciding your policy choices, and hopefully people are feeling that they're able to thrive here.
So what will some of the milestones be that you would set? You mentioned our obesity rates going down.
Right.
That might be one. What kinds of things, what kinds of milestones will you set to use to create some metrics to see how you're doing?
Yeah, I think that's probably going to be coming. I think since we're just right at the very beginning stages, we haven't really established those milestones. You'll find different jurisdictions have those in place. We have the Community Assessment Project. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. It's something that most of the communities throughout our state have, and it's sort of a snapshot of well-being. And that's sort of, those are the metrics that are generally used. That's a county-wide snapshot. In terms of safety, are you able to access the medical needs? You'll ask those types of questions, your connectedness to the environment, and so on. So, we could look at existing metrics and tools for what that could look like and where we want to go. The approach to be data-driven is important. We have scarce resources, and we want to be accountable to our scarce resources. So how can we do that? And I think, we have to establish some data indicators to help us do that.
Have you gotten any direction from other cities about how they're measuring their progress?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at any of the examples and see. Generally, you'll look at some of the folks that are not doing so well in communities and try to look at how you're going to bring those folks up. But there's also other metrics, sort of as mentioned in the CAP sort of data, in terms of how are people feeling do they feel hopeful for the future? Do they feel connected to their community? Can they give back in a meaningful way? Those types of sometimes difficult to measure metrics can be incorporated, as well as sort of the more standard kind of health metrics. So I mean, I'm assuming we'll incorporate some of those. The good thing is with some of our collective impact efforts, with supporting our nonprofit community, some of our metrics around climate change in terms of our planning around that, I think, honestly, we have a lot of it already established. It's for us to now take an opportunity to say, okay, which ones make the most sense for what we're trying to move here? And we're just starting that work, so there'll be more to come.
So this approach seems like it's really exciting and kind of new, but it looks like it will take some, I bet you, compromise.
Yes.
And we've seen the compromise not so common on the public, on the national stage.
Right.
What do you think your role in compromise in a local government is toward reaching this sort of goal, sort of shifting the way we view things and to get a different result?
I think it's essential. I think it's absolutely essential. Compromise is hard, especially as you were mentioning, when we're seeing a more polarized nation. And it has a role to play in every decision that we make, in my opinion. So compromise will absolutely be a component of it. The other thing is government moves slow, and I think, realistic expectation and intentionality is critical, and I sort of mentioned it earlier, we have various leaders that come through and council members that rotate through. So having, a shared understanding of the benefit has a lot of potential. And that too requires compromise. And it also requires an honest sort of look at where we're at and where we want to be, without judgment in some regard. Because, it initiates folks, get defensive. And naturally, I mean, there's so many things that are beyond our control. And people are doing really good hard work all the time, every day. And we at times can reflect in terms of how we want to move in a cycle of continuous improvement. But I 100% believe compromise always has a role to play at local government and beyond.
And everywhere else.
And everywhere else.
Yeah, so true, so true. So one of the things that is top of mind these days is the homeless in Santa Cruz. And that has been an issue for, well, not as long as I can remember, because I was born here, but it's been a long time, and it's a California issue too. Right. It's not just a Santa Cruz issue, and it is difficult to solve. Like in 2016, there was the Voices, Home Voices engagement study. It was sort of a community kind of talking kind of thing and collecting a lot of information. And from that, we found out that there was quite a bit of, there were a lot of interesting things going on in the housing community. Right. Landlords were evicting people because they could raise the rent if they had new tenants, and houses are being turned into basically dormitories for lots and lots of college students, or like to live in one home. And so we learned a lot of the downside. And then from that came some ideas about how to move forward, like changing permits, making it possible for people to build second units and that sort of thing. Where do we stand now? What have we done since that study? And has it moved us forward?
Yeah, I think again, that was a really great process that took place in terms of the community conversation around policy for housing as it relates to homelessness and the consequence of not having good housing options and all the complexities that surround that. I won't say it's just simply that. And came of that we had sort of three pillars that came from it. One was housing production. And so what are some of the policies that are, one, informed by community input, and two, that we can move on relatively quickly or take kind of a longer term lens towards. So in terms of the relatively quickly one was sort of how do we start to reduce barriers for ADU production? That was something that a lot of the community really seemed to be supportive of. So we've passed some policy along.
Can you say for the public what's ADU?
Sure, sorry, forgive me. ADU's accessory dwelling unit. And that is just the small units that can be on existing residential homes. And in terms of red tape at our level, and we were trying to increase, what can we do to reduce those barriers for people who are interested in pursuing ADU on their property? And that is also generally compatible for the most part with neighborhoods. So that's one example. Other types of housing production policies were outlined in the blueprint. We also had housing protection. How are we maintaining our existing housing stock? How are we ensuring that it's safe and well? What are the types of things that we're doing to support that as well? And the third was community vitality, and how are we thinking about, which I think really kind of is that broader kind of health and all policies lens about how are we contributing to the well-being of our community and supporting their ability to thrive here, because it's sort of affordable housing and then there's just sort of the cost of living. And so, for example, when thinking about the children's fund, if you're paying more for childcare than you are for your rent, if we're able to help reduce some of the costs for childcare, then we're essentially also helping bridge some of the costs for affordability of housing for you. So those sort of broader lens, or sort of the broader expansion of how to move forward in that direction. And there's elements that are continuing to move forward. As you know, one of the things that we've been really focused on and having a lot of our council energy spent on is the homeless issue. So I think there will be more to come in terms of progress on that.
What would you like to? I always like to, at the end of an interview, give the subject a chance to say something that I might not have asked you about.
Sure.
Is there something that you would like to share with the community that I didn't ask you about?
The only thing I would share is how grateful I am to serve our community, how appreciative I am when community members come with ideas or approach me with issues that I wouldn't otherwise know about. I often leave meetings with community members or stakeholders so inspired and informed, and it's so important. So if anything, that the community has a huge role in contributing to our understanding of needs, but also how we collectively can come forward with solutions. So I think, if anything, that would be, I guess, the final statement.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your coming and sharing the Health in All Policies idea. And taking the time to share that with the community. Thanks very much.
Of course, and I'll come back if you're interested at a future time and share any progress updates along
we sure
the way.
would. We would love to see some projects, so we'll definitely invite you back.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us today for Elected Spotlight. Good night. So we'll just keep talking.
Okay.